Are you ready to talk about admission statistics from the 2020-2021 admission cycle? I hope you are because I'm ready to talk about it, and it will only be talking today. As you can tell, I am not on video, and never fear, I am fine. I'm just not on camera at this point. So that allows you to really absorb the words and focus on the words more than the visuals today. Let's talk about the increased selectivity of colleges and universities in the United States that were already quite selective. The big theme here is COVID comes, then colleges make the decision to go test optional because they knew that the economic and social impact would be devastating for them if they remained test required. And they also wanted the positive PR of not making students go to a test site during a pandemic and sitting close to other students in a room where people were breathing near each other. So that was the upshot, of course. But the real upshot was, of course, becoming that much more selective statistically. So a college like Amherst, let's start in the A's, from 2020 to 2021, their overall admission selectivity, i.e., their acceptance rate overall, this is not ED or regular, this is just overall, went from roughly 12.5% or so to, closer to 8%. Closer to 8%. So, these are not huge number swings in terms of raw numbers, but they're pretty large percentage-wise, going from a roughly 12 to an 8% admissions rate at Amherst. Boston College, which was already on the downward swing after going ED in recent years and being able to yield far higher, they now, from 2020 to 2021, went from roughly a 22% overall acceptance rate to an acceptance rate of closer to 18%. BU. BU didn't see that much of a difference. BU went from roughly 20% to roughly 18%. Brown went from roughly 7.5% to closer to 5%. Columbia closer to 7% to around 4%. I'm sorry, it's 4. It's not. Yeah, maybe it was about 4%. Yeah, 4% of Columbia. So Dartmouth went from about 9% down to about 6%. Duke from about where did they go from? They went from about their acceptance rate went from about 7.5% to closer to 5.5%. Emory went from an acceptance rate overall of closer to 17% down to roughly 13%. Georgetown was one of the ones that was more of a holdout in terms of still sort of encouraging testing. They went from around 17% down to closer to 12, 13% overall acceptance rate. Georgia Tech went from 20% down to closer to 17, 18% acceptance rate. Harvard started off very small. Their acceptance rate in 2020 was 5% overall, and their acceptance rate now is closer to 3+%. Johns Hopkins went from roughly 9% down to about 6%. Middlebury saw a huge decline, went from overall acceptance rate to around 24% in 2020 to an acceptance rate of closer to 16% in 2021. MIT went from, goodness gracious me, about 7% down to 4%. Notre Dame, pretty small percentage reduction in sort of increase in selectivity, but a reduction in acceptance rate, went from about 16% down to closer to 15%. So 16 to 15%, not a huge swing there. NYU went from about 15% overall acceptance rate to closer to 13% acceptance rate. Again, these are rounding. I'm rounding here and there. It's rough numbers. Princeton's overall acceptance rate went from about 6% down to around 4%. Rice went from about 10% down to 9%, maybe a little bit below 9%. Swarthmore went from about 9% down to 8%. Tufts went from about 15% down to about 11 or 12%. It's interesting that the Tufts, they extended their ED deadline, remember, because they were so desperate to have more applications. So don't forget about that. They just literally changed their deadline midstream. So I find that very suspicious, and I still do. Florida, UF, obviously not in the Ivy range at all, but still a very sought-after university for a certain type of student. UF, they require testing. Good for them. I'm happy that some colleges still looked at objective measures as opposed to brownie points that teachers give these days in classes that are not even rigorous anymore. UF, basically their acceptance rate stayed the same. So good for UF. Georgia, University, and their acceptance rate, by the way, at UF was about 27, 28%. Georgia's acceptance rate went from, 46% overall down to about 39% overall. Penn went from about 7% down to 7+% down to about 6%. USC in sunny Southern California went from 16% down to about 13%. UVA stayed steady. UVA did stay steady, so that is interesting. They stayed at about 21%. Vanderbilt went from about, oh goodness gracious, about 9% overall acceptance rate down to about 7% acceptance rate. Villanova went from an overall acceptance rate of about 28% down to about 25%. WashU stayed pretty constant. Yale went from about 7.5 down to 5. Now remember, it's extremely important that you as a student who may be applying for a college or selective college or university in the coming weeks and months understand this. Overall acceptance rates are a mirage. They're not real. They don't matter. No one gets in on the overall acceptance rate. All of the colleges that I just named pretty much have multiple deadlines, and each unique deadline or admissions plan has its own acceptance rate and pros and cons and benefits and disadvantages, if you will. So it's extremely important that you understand that if I did an article on this years ago on admissions.blog about how UNC has basically 4 acceptance rates. They have at the time they had the early action for in-state, the early action for out-of-state, the regular decision for in-state, and the regular decision for out-of-state. All the colleges I went just through, let's go through Penn. So Penn has ED, and they also have regular. Harvard has EA and single choice, or whatever they call it, these restrictive, whatever they call it, and regular. Some of these schools on this list, like Vanderbilt, have ED1, ED2, and regular. So each one of those unique acceptance rates, admissions plans are going to have their own acceptance rates. So when I go over this, it's intimidating to hear that, all these colleges that have big names that I want to be associated with, their acceptance rates are going down. And it is true, but if you actually scratch the surface, admissions rate went down overall quite a bit. But if you really look, ED, early decision, still remains, in many cases, 2 to 3 times more likely to accept you at these schools like WashU or like Penn, etc., than regular. So it's always wise, if you can afford it, if you financially are capable of confidently applying and believing that you're going to get the aid you need, applying ED, because if you have that first choice, they like to yield the students ED. And regardless of what the overall acceptance rate, the early decision acceptance rate is often 2 to 3 times higher than regular decision. And so the regular decision rates are much smaller in order to accommodate for an overall acceptance rate. So keep that in mind. It's going to be another wild rodeo of admission season for 2022 because it will be test optional at most of these schools again. And therefore, the onus really will go on your essay writing, your demographics, sadly, as well as your grades in high school and letters of recommendation if you have them. So a lot of subjectivity, far more subjectivity in terms of getting into college than I would like. But I don't make the rules. I just help students and parents play the game. And it's a shame that so much of the admissions process now favors, again, people who already have a lot of means because they can highly airbrush elements of what they present, as can people who have fewer means available to them. But knowledge is power, and a lot of people do not have the knowledge they need to understand how they can structure their application in such a way as to beat the odds that I just shared with you. A lot of these colleges are still completely doable. You can get into these big name colleges if this is a goal of yours. And so it's all a matter of figuring out how you can play the game in such a way where you are going to present a overall portfolio application brand, if you will, that will be attractive to those people reading the admissions applications in that undergraduate admissions office. As I often will tell my clients, the average admissions officer is not your average American. They are a very unique demographic. And so if they are going to be stereotyping and demographic focused in their application review, we as applicants have to be very focused on appealing to that audience that is the admissions officer at these selective colleges and universities. So it's extremely important to know your audience and tailor your application accordingly within obviously still being honest on your applications. That's of course important, but what words you choose, how you choose to communicate, all those things really play a big deal in these days where objective measures like test scores are verboten in the eyes of these colleges and universities. Until next time, I will speak to you shortly, but I hope you enjoy today's audio video of admissions rates in 2021 compared to admissions rates in 2020. Best of luck.